The Signs of a Clarifying Record, the Meccan Quran. Part 1. Late Antique Arabia. We now come to the world's second largest religion, Islam. Like Christianity, Islam's size and scope is global and its manifestations diverse. So it means that it's especially difficult to say what all Muslims have in common. There are about 1.5 billion Muslims alive today, and there is a Muslim population in nearly every country on earth. And plus, once you account for all the Muslims who lived in the past, we're now talking about tens of billions of people. And so, like with Christianity, we have to ask, what do all these Muslims have in common? And like Christianity again, the answer is not much. But we can say three things with confidence. All Muslims speak of God as one. All Muslims believe that God sends messages to people, with the principal one of these being the Quran. And all Muslims believe that the recipients of these messages are prophets, one of whom was named Muhammad. So that's it. There is one God. There are many messages from that one God, including the Quran. And there are many prophets, including Muhammad. Everything else, like how one is to understand God, interpret his messages, or what one is to believe about the prophets, that's variable. Different Muslims will explain God, the messages, and the messengers in different ways. Islam begins in late antiquity. If you remember, late antiquity is that name for the time after the Roman world turned Christian, but before the Middle Ages. The imperial Christian church already existed and was endorsed by the Byzantine Roman Emperor in Constantinople. The Byzantine government held power over much of the Eastern Mediterranean world, and part of that power was its imperial Christianity. The Persian Empire was still a major player too. At this point in time, the Persian Empire was under the control of the House of Sassan, so the Persians were called the Sassanids or Sasanians. They were officially Zoroastrian, but there were large populations of Christians and Jews in their empire too. One of those populations, the Jews of Babylon, were those same Jews who compiled the Babylonian Talmud around the year 600. The Byzantine Romans and the Sasanian Persians had been fighting on and off for centuries. And between them was the vast desert of Central Arabia. Arabia had been periodically invaded by these great powers that surrounded it, but it had never been a central power itself. The middle of the peninsula was a desert in the most extreme sense of the term. One of the hottest regions on the planet. There are no navigable rivers, no major ports, no proper cities. There are a few oases here and there, but nothing that could sustain a large population. Most of the people supported themselves by clinging to their tribal groups, essentially large extended families. Although there was some agriculture and herding, nowhere in Central Arabia could be truly self-sufficient, so trading was paramount. Politically, the Arabian desert was a vacuum. Flanked by the great late antique empires, but not under the control of any of them, there was little that would warrant the cost of holding such an inhospitable region. There were occasional invasions, but they never actually held lasting authority beyond the coasts. That also meant that Central Arabia was considered something of a backwater. The Arab tribes, both the nomadic Bedouin and the settled town dwellers, traded with their imperial neighbors, but they weren't really a part of them either. They recognized no kings or aristocrats, and they didn't pay taxes to anyone. That also made Central Arabia culturally and religiously distinct from its neighbors. They spoke a number of different related dialects of Arabic, and writing was rare. Occasionally we see evidence of graffiti tags, but proper literature like books were a foreign luxury at best. They knew about books, of course. Christian priests and monks and Jewish rabbis had some books, but mostly these were in foreign languages, not Arabic, so not useful to your average Arab on the ground. What the tribal Arabs did have, though, was spoken lore. The most important of these was poetry, which one would have to memorize. The Arab poet wielded a great deal of social power. He controlled information and history. He could sing the glories of his tribe, or about their prowess in battle. And in a time and place where public information could only be stored in this oral form, the poet at once served as a tribal spokesman, a news reporter, and if that poet was inspired by a jinn, they were a quasi-religious figure too. Religiously, Arabia was quite diverse. Because they weren't living under any imperial power, imperial Christianity didn't hold sway there. The Arab tribes knew about these forms of Christianity, but no governmental church could enforce its views in this remote region. That is also why we see other regional forms of Christianity, Christianities that didn't agree with any imperial theology. What exact percentage of the Arab population was Christian is anyone's guess. We have some records of solitary monks living as hermits out in the desert, but we see no evidence of Arab churches or translations of the Bible into Arabic. However, even if there were few proper Christians around, the larger world, of which Arabia was just one small part, was very Christian by this time. So if you left Arabia to trade, and you went in almost any direction, you would be trading with Christians. And that also meant the stories of the Christians, accounts of Jesus and other Christian heroes like saints, were well known, even if most Central Arabians didn't actually call themselves Christian. And again, these stories would be passed in mostly oral formats as folktales and sayings. There were also a number of Arab Jews. Arab Jews, like Jews everywhere, considered themselves descendants of Abraham. But they, and perhaps all Arabs, didn't think that they came from the same line as the 12 tribes of Israel, who were descended from Abraham's youngest son, Isaac. But rather, the Arabs were the descendants of Abraham's oldest son, Ishmael. And Abraham said to God, "If only Ishmael might live under your blessing." Then God said, "Yes, but your wife Sarah will bear a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. I will make him into a great nation." This second nation to spring from Abraham was, from ancient times, considered to be the Arabs. And this made sense. Arabia bordered the land of Judah and the Roman province of Judea. The Arabic languages were directly related to Hebrew and Aramaic, and so people could naturally conclude that Arabs and Judeans were literally related too. Non-Arabs often even called the Arabs Ishmaelites, the sons of Ishmael. And when the Jewish diaspora began, many Judeans fled south into Arabia to join up with the Arab Jewish settlements there, beyond the reach of the Romans. Judaism remained common in the Central Arabian lands into late antiquity. And, like with the stories of the Christians, Jewish folktales from the Tanakh, the Mishnah, and the two Talmuds were abundant, but only orally. And because Central Arabia wasn't under the control of any imperial Christian rulers, Arabian paganism still survived. Just to remind you, these people wouldn't have called themselves pagans. They would have just called themselves by their ethnic or tribal names, and that would have implied the gods that you worshipped. So if you were a Meccan member of the Quraysh tribe, that meant you worshipped the gods of Mecca and the Quraysh tribe. People still believed in jinn, personal or local spirits, and fertility goddesses like Al-Uzha. Arab pagan practice, like other paganisms, was centered around temple cults. Since Arabia was a poor region, these temples were mostly just freestanding sanctums called cubes, or Kaabas in Arabic. There would be festivals at these Kaabas and yearly pilgrimages called the Hajj, when you would travel to visit the gods and participate in the cult yourself. Remember that paganism is usually pluralistic. Pagan Arabs had goddesses like Al-Uzha, but they also believed in the Jewish and Christian God, who they called by the Arabic version of Elohim, Allah, the God. And by the way, Arabic-speaking Jews and Christians still call God Allah today, so the name isn't unique to Islam. Part 2. Muhammad and the Oral Quran. The pluralism of Arabian culture and religion is important here. We have populations of pagans, Jews, and Christians, all Arabs, living side by side for centuries and with little outside political influence to give one group power over the others. And there were few or no written books in Arabic to standardize people's theology, stories, or cultures. So in short, no one had the power to enforce any kind of orthodoxy or orthopraxy. The Arabs were also therefore free to intertwine freely. There were people telling Jewish and Christian stories who were not themselves Jews or Christians. We have pagans talking about and probably worshipping the biblical god Allah, along with their own gods and jinn. And Jews and Christians could also go on the Hajj to participate in the mysteries of the Kaaba's cults. In fact, local legend even said that the Kaaba in the town of Mecca was actually built by Abraham in honor of the biblical god, and only later did it become home to pagan gods. This pluralistic mix of Arab paganism, Christianity, and Judaism was the setting into which Muhammad was born. He was a Meccan, and in his time, Mecca would have been a very small village with little influence beyond the region. Mecca was home to a Kaaba, which was maintained by the tribe of Quraysh, Muhammad's own tribe. Muhammad was a marginal figure in the Quraysh. He was from a clan within the tribe that had little influence, and Muhammad himself was an orphan. His father died before he was born, and his mother died when he was 6. Plus, he had no siblings. Now, remember that in a tribal world, everything is about family connections. And in an extreme environment like Central Arabia's, where no one can survive on their own, an orphan would have been considered something like a leech, a dependent on the generosity and hospitality of other relatives. But fortunately for Muhammad, he did have extended family members who cared about him personally. First his grandfather, and then later his uncle. But still, by all normal measures, he was a minor player in a minor town. He did make a name for himself as a merchant, someone who knew the caravan routes and was considered trustworthy. One of his employers, a widow named Khadija, was so impressed by his honest work that she proposed marriage to him. Muhammad accepted, and together they had 4 daughters, as well as 2 sons who died in infancy. There's a lot more to say about the historical Muhammad, but once again we hit a snag. Like we saw with Jesus, the Buddha, and Confucius, most of the biographical materials we have about Muhammad come from much later times. His earliest biographies appeared more than a century after his death. Now we're going to get into those literatures later, but unlike Jesus, Siddhartha, and Confucius, there are records of Muhammad that came from his own time. The key one of these is the Quran, a revelation from God that Muhammad claimed to have brought. We have a few fragments of the Quran that have been radiocarbon dated to within his own lifetime. And vocabulary analyses of the text show that it speaks with a single voice throughout, meaning it doesn't appear to have been heavily edited by multiple people later. So, in the Quran, we have a rather reliable link back to this man himself. Well, sort of. See, Muhammad didn't claim to be the author of the Quran. He said that he was a prophet. He was channeling the words of God. And therefore, the Quran rarely speaks from Muhammad's own point of view. He's only mentioned by name 5 times in the entire text. The Quran does speak to Muhammad. It often refers to the prophet, or the messenger, or just the singular masculine you, but it rarely gives us biographical material in any detail. So, if it isn't a biography, what is the Quran? The word Quran means a recitation, or a recital. It's something to be said out loud in a formal way, like a chant. And strictly speaking, it isn't a text at all. Sure, there are written copies of the Quran, but it is first and foremost a collection of oral performances to be recited out loud, memorized, and carefully vocalized. It's much closer to oral poetry or music than written narratives like the Torah or the Gospels, although traditionally, Muslims don't consider the Quran to be either poetry or music. It's something of a genre unto itself. And this also makes for a major problem when it comes to studying the Quran. First, because the Quran is a series of oral performances, it isn't in any narrative or chronological order. Like a spoken conversation, the Quran changes topic quickly, hooks back to return to earlier points, and doesn't have a single plot the way, say, a written composition would. Complicating the matter, the sections or surahs of the Quran, the 114 units the Quran is composed of, are arranged by length, not the order in which they actually appeared, or according to the themes which they're discussing. So, if you just pick up a written copy of the Quran and start reading from page 1, you're going to get lost very quickly. If you read this recitation as if it were a written text, it seems random, jumbled, and repetitive. Second, the Quran is stuck in Arabic, purposely. The Quran is surprisingly self-aware. It talks about itself, a lot. It says that it's supposed to be an oral recitation, a Quran, and it repeatedly says that it's specifically to be in Arabic. And it revels in its Arabic. It's melodic and fluid. Quranic passages are littered with puns and wordplay, rhymes and reprises, and elegant turns of phrase, which, in translation, end up ringing flat or redundant. So, reading the oral Arabic Quran in written English is sort of like trying to appreciate a song by only reading the sheet music. But the Quran isn't made to be read. It's made to be said. Here's a short section of the Quran where it talks about being generous and warns you not to be a hypocrite. I made the rhyme scheme sort of match the Arabic original just so you get the idea, but as we're going to see, a lot gets lost in translation. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Have you seen the one who denies the recompense? For that is the one who repels the parentless, and does not hunger to feed the penniless. So woe to the supplicants, who in supplications are unwary, who are showy, and they withhold charity. First, God is invoked as merciful and compassionate. This is a very common phrase in the Quran, and it begins most of its surahs. In Arabic, these words echo each other. Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. Then, there are some people who claim that there is no recompense, that there's not going to be a day when they're repaid for all the deeds they did or didn't do. That is, people who deny that there's going to be a day of judgment at the end of time. These particular people are cruel to orphans and don't try to help the poor. But the original wording plays on the themes of being without a family and being poor that it's kind of hard to see in translation. For instance, these wicked deniers of the Day of Judgment repel or shove away the parentless, orphans. And the whole problem with orphans in a tribal society is that they're alone. So wicked people pushing orphans away is actually making their loneliness worse. And likewise, not only do they not feed the poor, they don't hunger to feed the poor. See, the problem with poor people is that they're hungry. And these evil people don't feel that hunger inside of themselves to end the hunger of others. And in Arabic, the words recompense, parentless, and penniless rhyme. Deen, yatim, miskin. So the relationship between Judgment Day, poverty, and abandoned children is very obvious. And then we're told that these people being argued with are themselves religious. They are supplicants, literally ones who pray. So these people say their prayers, but they don't understand the point of these prayers. The prayers are supposed to cultivate a sense of charity with the less fortunate. But these people just go through the motions. They are unwary, and they're just saying their prayers to show others how pious they are. But the evidence of their hypocrisy is that they withhold charity. They don't do good things for other people. And again, a rhyme scheme underscores the relationship between their neglect, sahun, their showiness, yarahun, and their lack of charity, ma'un. And on top of all that, the Quran is supposed to be vocalized beautifully. So even if you don't think it's important to help orphans and the poor, you still might be struck by the aesthetics of the argument. So here's this same passage recited in the original, which, as you'll see, even if you don't know any Arabic, carries a bit more of a punch than the English translation.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أرأيت الذي يكذب بالدين فذلك الذي يدع اليتيم ولا يحض على طعام المسكين فويل للمصلين الذين هم عن صلاتهم ساهون الذين هم يراءون ويمنعون الماعون.
Part 3. The themes of the Quran in Mecca. So aside from helping orphans and the poor, what does the Quran talk about? Remember that the Quran appeared in the world of late antique Arabia. It's speaking to Jews, Christians, and pagans all at once. And so it's going to ask what undergirds all these different viewpoints and practices. How are they right and how are they wrong? And so really what it's asking is, between all these different worldviews, what's really real? Well, God is real, and there's only one God. And there would be no need for other gods anyway, because this one God has many different powers, functions, and names. He is a God of everything, and everything that can be truly called God is Him. God is the powerful, the knowing, the creator, the fashioner, the judge, the compassionate, the forgiving, the giver of life, and the bringer of death. Later, a tradition attributed to Muhammad would claim that there are 99 names of God, a multiplicity of names for a single reality. Whatever is ultimately real is alone that one God, acting under a variety of different names and functions. But at the same time, the Quranic God is beyond human comprehension. When limited human beings look at the material world around themselves, all they can see are God's activities and powers, and so they mistake these things for gods themselves. That is, they commit shirk, association, or a false association of God with not God. This is the Quran's quintessential sin, attributing ultimate value to something other than the one true God. So does that mean that everything that isn't God doesn't really exist? No. The world God made is real, but nothing in this world is God himself. Instead, everything in the world is a sign, ayah, plural ayat. When you look at the natural world around you, the moon and the sun, animals, plants, the earth and the heavens, you're supposed to see them as signifiers of God and his power. They are signs of God, but not God himself. They point to something bigger and truer than themselves. Shirk, association, is misinterpreting the sign as referring to itself, thinking a sign of God is God. And that also means that the Quran is saying that you don't need new information to see and understand God. You have signs of God all around you. We shall show them our signs in the horizons and in themselves, until it becomes clear to them that it is the truth. You don't need to be told new data, but rather you have to remember things you already know. One of the most common commands in the Quran is remember. When you remember something, it means that you're looking at something you know already. You are reconsidering a memory, summoning up a thought already inside of you. All of God's signs are in the world around you. You know about them. And if you look through them, not to them, then you'll know the truth. And it isn't just natural phenomena either. There are signs in the stories of ancient people that the Quran's first audience would already know. Stories of prophets and holy people whose lives reveal or remind people of God. People like Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus are prophets, messengers God has sent with signs like miracles or revealed texts. The Quran never says, there are some people who are really important that you've never heard of before, but rather, there are stories and people that you now know already, but that you need to consider more carefully. Now, none of these people, these prophets, are God, including Jesus, but all of them are signs of God, and they bring signs of God. And it isn't just the biblical prophets either. God has sent prophets to every people on earth, speaking various languages. We have raised up in every community a messenger, saying, serve God. And so again, there's no news here. Everyone has received prophets and messages from God. The signs, the ayat, are already in place, if only you would remember. And now there is a new prophet, Muhammad, and he's bringing a message from God to the people, just like the other prophets did long ago. For instance, here is the Quran talking about where it came from. Surely it is descending from the Lord of the worlds. The trustworthy Spirit has brought it down on your heart, so that you may be one of the warners in a clarifying Arabic language. Surely it is indeed in the scriptures of the old ones. Was it not a sign for them that was known to the learned of the tribes of Israel? So the Quran is not bringing people a message they don't know about already, but rather, the Quran is a clarification of the knowledge already in you, a reminder. All of the prophets in the past, and this new prophet, Muhammad, are calling people to look at the world as signs of God, to see that only God is God, and that if you look through the world around you and into the stories within you, then you'll understand. And the Quran, like older revealed texts, is a warning. There's a final day of judgment coming, when people will all be resurrected from the dead to be tried for their recognition of the one God and their treatment of other people. Those who remembered that God alone is God and treated their fellow creations with kindness and justice will be rewarded with entrance into the garden, a bodily paradise of delights, including food and sexual pleasure, for even these are signs of God's love and generosity for His creation. For people who ignored God, ignored the poor and the unfortunate, and committed shirk, they would be cast into the fire as punishment. So, to prevent people's damnation, God sends signs and revealed messages as reminders, warnings to clarify what is really going on. By listening to the Quran and reciting it yourself, then you will know where you came from, who authored you, who authored the ancient stories, and who authored the whole universe. God will someday return you to Himself, bringing you back from where you came from. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Recite in the name of your Lord who created the human from a blood clot. Recite, for your Lord is the generous, who taught by the pen, taught the human what he knew not. No, indeed, for the human transgresses insolent, because he thinks that he is self-sufficient. Surely to your Lord is the return. Questions for class discussion. What was the political, religious, and cultural world which Muhammad was born into? What are Quraysh, Kaaba, Hajj, Surah, Shirk, and Ayat? What are the major themes of the Quran in Mecca?